I didn't plan to press play. The tape was misfiled, slotted sideways between two boxes that shouldn't have been near each other, the way teeth sometimes crowd in a jaw. Dust had written its own date on the cardboard. 1967 in the finger-width clean line I dragged across the lid. I felt the grit under my nails. I heard the tiny rasp it made, a small dry hiss. No one else was in the sub-basement. The motion sensor lights clicked awake like tired eyes. Cold air, ozone, and old paper. A faint metallic sweetness, the smell of magnetic tape that hasn't breathed in decades. I told myself I was just cataloging. I told myself I was making order. But the truth is simple. Some names on boxes pull you the way the ocean pulls a body long after the tide has turned. Project Vox Mentis. Prototype phase. NAR room audio black letters, stamped twice, misaligned. I traced them like they were raised, like braille for the impatient. My thumb found the notch, and the lid came free with a sigh the room shouldn't have made. Inside, a reel-to-reel, the acetate browned at the edges, and a note card with a rubber band fossilized to crumbs. Typed lines marched across it until they broke into a jittering typosphere near the bottom, as if the typist had stopped believing in the alphabet. Exposure under 90s. No observed tissue change. Cognitive intrusion reported. Protocol Omega. Maintain lead shielding. Avoid concurrent heartbeat monitoring. My pulse climbed just reading it. It felt like eavesdropping on a heart that wasn't mine. I carried the reel to the old Revox on the steel table. It weighed more than it looked like it should. Weight belongs to secrets. The pinch roller was still gummy from the last time someone tried to resurrect something beyond its shelf life. I turned the machine over and listened. You can hear when a thing wants to work. Motors talk to hands, click, power. A soft insect hum woke in the chassis and spread into the table, into my forearms. I threaded the leader through the guides, over the heads, under the tension arm. My fingers remembered the path like ritual. I told myself I would just test a second or two. A flicker, nothing sustained. Just enough to confirm the label and then reshelve. The leader was spliced with amber tape. On it, a pencil scratch. VM01A. Room A. Monitor on. No words. The last two words snagged me. No words. Why record sound that had no words? I glanced at the door. The exit light was a flat cherry. Nothing in the concrete corridor. Above the table, a clock ticked each second like a nail-tapping glass. I adjusted the monitor volume down to a whisper. I could still hear my breathing. I could hear the flit of dust as it moved in the light. I could hear the idea of footsteps beyond the wall, even though there was nobody there. Play. The tape moved. The world leaned. At first it was the room listening to itself. The specter of hiss, the bed of noise that says you are pointed at the past. A bit of 60 cycle hum, shouldered down by a notch filter someone had set too aggressively. Then a faint breath. Not human, mechanical. A ventilator, no. The breath had the rhythm of a person, but the timbre of something inside a coil. I raised the volume by a notch you could measure in eyelashes. The baseline subtlety thickened. A not-quite tone slid under the hiss like a limb under a sheet. It made my eyes focus on nothing. The corners of the room softened. The clock's ticking stopped being ticks and became intervals in a long, patient animal. I said it out loud to break the spell. Just artifact. But my voice sounded like it had been recorded after the fact and dubbed back into my mouth. My tongue was slightly too heavy. The word artifact arrived in my head a beat before I heard myself say it. I became aware of the pressure behind my eyes. A tide, distant like blood thinking. The tape had no words, but under the no words, something like a pattern breathed. I could feel the geometry even before I knew I was feeling it. A rough circle, a line that never quite closed. A bead of sweat gathered at my lower lip as if drawn by it. I do not sweat easily. The room wasn't warm. I hovered a finger over stop. Then I pulled my hand away as if the button were a tooth in a mouth I didn't trust. Whir. The reels kept their pact. I imagined the magnetic domains, aligned and frozen since 1967, reasserting themselves across the head gap, telling the metal what fear sounded like. I imagined the engineers who cut this tape, wearing white shirts and short sleeves, ties loosened because the ideas ran hot. I saw an ashtray with the kind of cigarettes that leave a sting at the back of the nose when you smell them 50 years later in a closed file. A faint knock registered in the recording, or in the room. My spine adapted to both truths. Another knock, offset, like an echo from the wrong direction. I turned the monitor level a hair upward, the hum ate distance. My breath shortened to match it syllable by syllable. Then, and this is the moment that still doesn't settle, the sound seemed to notice me. It pulled attention like a face across a crowd, not volume, presence. The way a dark doorway becomes a sentence when you realize the room beyond it doesn't match the building it is in. My fingertips cooled. The skin at my forearms pebbled without wind. The not quite tone found a frequency where my chest wanted to answer. Something in me wanted to hum back, a subsyllable with no grammar. The note card had said no words. But I understood what wasn't being said. The way you understand a person nodding from the end of a long hall, a nod that means, come here, even though your feet are already at the edge of the frame. I reached for the volume again. I don't know why. Maybe because they wrote that warning. Maybe because whenever someone says don't, the brain completes the sentence as an invitation. The motor noise thickened as the tape rolled deeper into itself. A soft glitch. Splicing tape crossing the head. Then the room in the recording came forward. I could feel the dimensions of it. 6 by 10. A window the size of a throat at the far end. Water pipes throbbing inside cinder block. Something tapped the metal table I stood over. I flinched. The Revox stuttered. The tape didn't. I set my palms flat and felt the hum pass through me like a low tide through pilings. My scalp prickled as if a hand had rested there with absolute care. A breath in the recording changed. If I'd been wearing headphones, it would have been inside my skull. I hadn't put them on. They were right there, lead-lined, as the card advised, as if anyone had ever built such a thing with a straight face. The cups stared at me like two small doors to a bad inside. I didn't touch them. I listened with the room, with my skin. A resonance hardened. The clock on the wall forgot how to tick. The air was threaded. The pressure behind my eyes became a second set of eyes. I blinked to let one set rest, but both kept seeing. The sound drew a slow curve across the space of me, the way a finger draws fog from a window. I realized my jaw had clenched to keep a shape from leaving my mouth. This is ridiculous, I thought. It's just a tone. It's just tape. But my body disagreed. My body remembered stairs I had never descended. It remembered a hall painted government grey. It remembered a sign that said Room A in letters that made promises to another alphabet. I pressed stop. The reels eased. The hum decayed. The room returned to the scale of things, to the size of inventory, of grid lines, and light switches and fire extinguishers that do not dream. I swallowed, and the sound of my throat was a door closing. I should have rewound. I should have reboxed it. I should have logged the accession number and the shelf position and the condition assessment and left a note for restoration and walked away. Instead, I leaned into the mic and spoke, because saying a thing out loud makes it share the weight. My name is, I said, and then didn't say my name. Some part of me refused to give it to the tape. I'm cataloging an item titled Project Vox Mentis, Prototype Phase, Room A, Recording Proceeds. If anyone hears this besides me, I listened to the quiet that followed my words. It was not empty. It pressed back. The tape waited like a lungful to the edge. Tell me what you think they were trying to hide. Tell me what you think they were trying to hide. In 1967, the world still trusted white noise. At least that's what the records say, when radio static was simply static. and no one suspected that the emptiness between stations could listen back. Project Vox Mentis began beneath the sandflats of Lincoln County, Nevada, 21 miles north of the old atomic test range. The installation had no name on maps, just a designation: Facility NAR-1. Its official purpose, according to Department of Defense filings, was acoustic pattern research for rapid psychological stabilization. Unofficially, it was a response to something that happened on Flight 311 from Frankfurt to Washington, D.C. the year before, an in-flight experiment with subsonic frequencies that ended with 7 passengers unconscious and 1 radio operator repeating a single phrase into the cockpit microphone for 14 minutes straight. "It's listening through me." By October of '67, the project was staffed by 12 people, 6 scientists, 4 technicians, 1 military liaison, and 1 sound archivist, Dr. Ellen Moreau, age 39, acoustician, French émigré, former lecturer at Caltech, a woman whose entire life had been built on the belief that every sound had a shape, and that shape could be drawn. They brought her in because she had once published a paper describing resonant empathy, a hypothetical condition in which certain frequencies could evoke emotional synchrony among test subjects without verbal input. The paper had been cited twice, then buried. Someone in Washington had apparently dug it up again, circled a sentence in red pencil, and written, "Find her." Facility NAR-1 was built on an old communications bunker left from the atomic days, walls 15 inches thick, steel beams ribbed like a submarine. The labs were windowless. The only clocks were on the intercom panels. Inside room A, microphones hung from the ceiling like fruit that had forgotten the tree. In the center stood a single steel chair, bolted to the floor. The chair's headrest carried 2 black sensors shaped like petals. The scientists called it the cradle. They weren't recording voices. They were recording the spaces between voices, the echo before a word forms, the resonance that trembles in the skull milliseconds before sound emerges. Their theory was that consciousness left acoustic residue, that thought under certain stimulation might be heard. To isolate that threshold, they built a tone generated not from sine waves or white noise, but from brain map data of a sleeping volunteer. The sound that would later be called Vox Mentis began as an electroencephalographic pattern translated into hertz. It was a dream, played aloud. Early test logs mention the tone as subaudible, perceived only through skin vibration. Yet even technicians who monitored the equipment through insulated glass began to describe nausea, disorientation, and, most consistently, the sense of being overheard. One log entry from November 3rd reads, "Subject number 2 displayed involuntary crying at 0.23 exposure. No thermal stress, no verbal content detected. Claimed to remember a memory that wasn't mine. Terminated test. Subject stable, but refuses to enter any quiet space." The Air Force observer at the time, Captain Monroe Hale, dismissed the results as psychosomatic hysteria. But when the team replayed the tape of the session, an anomaly appeared at the 23-second mark. A mirror waveform, perfect inversion of the subject's vocal frequency, existing without any recorded emission from their mouth. Dr. Moreau called it the echo that shouldn't exist. The team, against directive, looped that anomaly and played it back into the cradle. The output registered an unprogrammed modulation, a pulse that did not correspond to any generator or instrument in the room. The oscillograph traced a shape that flickered between coherence and chaos, a waveform that almost spelled a human breath. They froze the frame and printed it. The image looked like the profile of a face, eyes closed, mouth slightly open as if whispering under glass. That was the first day Project Vox Mentis stopped being about acoustics and became something else entirely. Ellen kept the printout in a folder marked "Calibration Errors," but at night she opened it under the sodium light near the stairwell. tracing the waveform with her fingertip, memorizing each valley. She said the pattern made her feel watched, but not by anyone in the facility. "It's the tone itself," she told one of the techs. "It learns. You can almost hear it, thinking." 2 weeks later, they tried something different. They asked volunteers to speak into the waveform, to read simple sentences while exposed to the tone. Every time, playback revealed that the tone erased certain words, specifically pronouns. I, you, me, we, gone, sliced out of the magnetic field as if edited in real time. Dr. Moreau's notes from December 1st. Language fragmentation, proportional to emotional intensity. The tone rejects identity statements. Possible self-defense mechanism? The funding board considered the data promising but erratic. Washington demanded quantifiable effects, not philosophy. They wanted the tone weaponized. The order was phrased politely: investigate potential for cognitive deterrence. But everyone in NAR1 understood what that meant, a sound that could silence thought. When the team objected, citing the unpredictability of the exposure results, Command sent a liaison directly from DC to enforce compliance. His name was Major Rowan Pike, and he carried the kind of smile that only bureaucrats and executioners share. Pike's first directive: continuous test recording, no edits, no omissions, every second preserved. The facility changed after that. The hum of the machines took on a pulse. The corridors began to sound hollow, even when people filled them. It was as if the concrete had started to echo the tone back to itself. First-person fragment. When I listened to those files in the archive, the raw reels from '67, I could feel their fatigue bleeding through the tape. The air vents rattle like lungs too tired to breathe. You can almost hear Dr. Moreau tapping her pencil against the metal desk, counting. The way she says, again, between trials, it's not a command, it's a plea. And when the tone fades, there's always that silence, the one that seems to lean closer like a listener bending to a confession. I know that silence. It's the same that filled the room when I pressed play. That's when I realized this wasn't just a study. It was a cover-up. They called it the deep listening phase. After December 1967, every test began with a 30-second silence, a clearing interval before playback. That silence became a ritual, a kind of psychological exhale the team performed unconsciously. It was supposed to ground the subject, though the logs show it only made the exposure's effect stronger. The mind doesn't rest in quiet, it hunts for noise. The tone entered at 20 hertz, a threshold felt, not heard, and climbed to 32, oscillating like a breath between muscle and memory. The first subjects described it as pressure, or a memory trying to speak. Then came Test 12A, December 8th. That is the recording the archivist found on the reel labeled VM01A, Room A, monitor on, no words. Dr. Moreau sat behind the observation glass, eyes red from sleeplessness. Beside her, Captain Hale noted pulse rates while Major Pike watched the clock, timing the exposures to the second. Inside room A, subject No. 7 sat in the steel chair. Male, 31, technician by trade, volunteered after several test assistants refused further participation. Electrodes mapped his temporal lobe activity. His name was Peter Lang. Silence. The air conditioning hum merges with heart rate monitors. Groshiru 10. Subject exhales twice. Eyes open, but not focused. Odro 32. Tone introduced at 20 Hz. Odro 15. Subject blinks rapidly. Says, feels like remembering. Odro 14. Tone amplitude increased by 0.3 dB. 0118. Subject's pupils dilate. 0 to 130. Reports, pressure behind my name. 0141. Begins to hum in synchrony with tone. 21. Tone modulation appears self-directed, equipment not registering command input. At 2 minutes in, the waveform changed shape. spontaneous interference creating new harmonics that no instrument in the room was generating. On the scope, the trace bent into twin loops, like parentheses closing around nothing. The oscillograph paper burned slightly where the stylus paused, as if the sound had momentarily held its breath. Dr. Moreau whispered, "It's writing itself." Captain Hale marked the event as equipment feedback error. Major Pike didn't write anything. He just watched Lang's mouth, which was moving without forming words. First-person fragment, the archivist. When I heard that moment on the tape, my ears rang like they were full of water. The tone is quiet, almost inaudible, but you feel it in the molars, a pulsing that isn't sound exactly, more like the body remembering how to listen. I turned the gain down and still felt it through the table. Every breath Lang took bled into my own. I found myself breathing in time with him, like the tape had hands pressed against my chest, keeping rhythm. At 3 minutes, Lang's eyes rolled back. The monitors spiked, then flattened. No cardiac signal, no EEG trace, just a white field of perfect noise. The technicians panicked. Hale ordered the tone stopped, but the Revox didn't respond. Even without current, the tape kept spinning. Inside the room, Lang's mouth opened as if to speak, yet no sound came out. On the waveform, a voice appeared anyway, a voice with no source. Later, analysis identified speech frequencies corresponding to human range, but reversed in phase. A mirror language, sentences that cancelled themselves out. Only when reversed again did they form intelligible fragments. "You are the echo. They built it to listen, not to speak. Don't remember me." Dr. Moreau froze the playback and replayed those 3 seconds again and again until the oxide began to shed from the tape. When she finally stopped, her hands were shaking. She asked to see the raw data from Lang's brain sensors. The file had already been wiped, replaced by static. Major Pike took the copy of the waveform photo from her folder. He told her to maintain focus on deliverables. But everyone saw the tremor in his wrist. For the rest of the day, he refused to enter any room that had speakers in it. First person. I remember pausing there. On the tape, you can hear the scrape of Dr. Moreau's chair against the floor. The only human sound left. And then, the thing that replaces silence. A second breath, slower, deeper, not synced with any living person in that room. That's when my ears began to ache, not hurt, ache, like sound pushing through bone. I thought the volume had spiked. It hadn't. The VU meters were dead flat. Still, I could feel words forming beneath the noise, trying to push into coherence. I wrote them down as I heard them. "We used you to hear us. The mouth is only one side of the throat." I shut the reel off, but even in silence the pressure stayed, a phantom of the tone, a vibration living under the floor. Back in 1967, the team concluded Lang's episode as neural overstimulation non-fatal. He regained consciousness 6 hours later, but with complete aphasia. He could hum, whistle, even laugh, but could no longer form words. EEG scans showed erratic wave synchronization, identical to the mirror waveform seen earlier. Dr. Moreau refused further tests on human subjects. Her memo to command read, "The signal now behaves as if observing us. Recommend cessation of trials until we determine how it adapts." Pike overruled her. He proposed a closed-loop exposure, feeding the recorded mirror signal back into itself to see if it stabilized. The others called it recursive resonance. Ellen called it suicide. The loop test took place on December 12th. At 23:17 hours, they ran the tone through dual amplifiers, routing output directly into the recording input, a sonic Mobius strip. The wave folded over itself, producing oscillations at intervals corresponding to human REM cycles. The walls began to hum. The air pressure rose by 5%, enough to rattle the lab glass. Technicians fled the control room. Only Moreau stayed, staring at the scope. The waveform wasn't chaotic anymore. It was alive with symmetry. The loops converged into a single frequency that spiked for exactly 3 seconds, then collapsed to silence. In that silence, the microphone recorded something impossible, a heartbeat, single, human, unassigned. The sound didn't come from anybody in the room. They checked every sensor. Nothing, but the waveform S pattern matched Peter Lang's heart rate, the one that had vanished 3 days earlier. First person, archivist. When that heartbeat plays, even now, the reel seems to tighten. It's quiet but precise. One pulse, then nothing. I tried overlaying it with my own pulse, thinking maybe it would cancel out like noise-canceling headphones. But when they met, the room dimmed. The walls seemed to draw closer, half an inch at a time. I swear I could see my breath move toward the speakers, not away. That was when I knew the experiment never really ended. It was still looping, decades later, through anyone who dared to listen, through me. The official report from December 13th, 1967, listed Project Vox Mentis as temporarily suspended pending ethical review. No further entries exist. The lab was sealed. Funding shifted to a new code, Monarch 2A. Most of the team transferred or disappeared. Dr. Ellen Moreau resigned, citing neurological fatigue. She was last documented living near Tonopah, Nevada, under a different name. The reels were boxed, misfiled, and left to ferment in magnetic silence for 58 years, until a hand reached into the dust and pressed play. Whispered, first-person closing of the block. Sometimes I wonder if the sound waited for someone like me. Someone whose curiosity would outweigh their caution. Maybe that's how it travels. Not through air, but through attention. And if that's true, then by hearing this, you're already part of the next test. The day the system failed, there was no scheduled test. Facility NAR-1 had gone quiet after the recursive exposure. Half the crew was gone, reassigned, or simply missing. The rest worked in half-light, pretending to archive equipment while avoiding the room labeled A. The hum of the generators had changed. It used to pulse steady, 60 cycles per second. Now it drifted, subtly modulating, like something breathing through the wires. Dr. Ellen Moreau spent those final days alone in the monitoring wing. The reports called it post-exposure insomnia. Her personal notes, later recovered from a burned folder, tell a different story. The tone doesn't stop when playback ends. It hides in the gaps, between ticks, between sentences. You think silence is safe, but silence is just the sound holding its breath. She kept hearing it, in the air ducts, in her own heartbeat. At one point she wrote, "It's trying to remember itself through me." The collapse began on December 17, 1967, at 04:12 hours. A technician named Grace Kettering entered the control room to perform maintenance on the magnetic heads. The system was unplugged, reels stored. Still, she heard a faint resonance coming from the machine, too low for ordinary hearing, but deep enough that her bones vibrated. The log records her words before the power returned. "It's not off." Security footage shows her standing still for 42 seconds, her head tilted, listening. Then she smiles. Slow, mechanical, like a puppet remembering how. She crosses the room, presses the power switch on, though the indicator light was already glowing. Within seconds, all 4 recording units began spinning, empty reels turning at synchronized speeds. The amplifiers came alive, but no input registered. Just silence. The silence was the sound. The event that followed became known, at least among the few who survived to report it, as the Cascade. Every intercom in the facility clicked open simultaneously. Every light flickered in phase with the tone. The hum rose through the spectrum, passing through speech range into something no human organ was built to interpret. Instruments measured it as frequency drift, but people felt it as thought, not external, but inside their skulls, blending with their inner monologue until they couldn't tell where one stopped and the other began. Witness statements later recovered described the effect. It spoke using my own memories. The lights blinked in words. I heard my dead son humming the calibration tone. In the corridor, the steel beams themselves began to sing, micro vibrations generating overtones that produced human vowels. First-person fragment, The Archivist. Listening to that section of the reel was like watching an aneurysm in sound. The waveform spikes are impossible. They fold backward, like the machine recorded the future before it happened. I could see it on the screen, and then, a second later, hear what I'd just seen. And beneath it all, I could swear I heard a voice calling a name. Not Lang's, not Moreau's, mine. Inside room A, Dr. Moreau tried to shut down the power manually. The emergency cutoff failed. She pulled the circuit fuses. Still, the tone persisted, generated not by the machines, but by the air itself, vibrating in sympathy. Grace Kettering collapsed near the observation glass, laughing and sobbing in alternating breaths. The laughter synchronized perfectly with the waveform peaks. She wasn't laughing at something, she was laughing for it, as if the sound had borrowed her lungs to express joy. Hale and Pike fought over the decision to evacuate. Hale wanted to shut everything down, flood the lab with foam. Pike insisted on recording until the end, claiming, "We need to know how far it goes." Neither made it out before the ceiling speakers ruptured. When the amplifiers overloaded, the sound inverted. Witnesses described a pressure drop, not an explosion, but implosion. The air folded inward, dragging light with it. For 3 seconds, Facility NAR-1 became a black cavity. Then the tone stopped. What remained was silence so dense it had texture, like velvet pressed into the skull. First person, The Archivist. When I reached that part of the tape, the recording glitched. It looped 3 seconds over and over, but each loop was slightly different, like a room trying to remember what it used to look like. On the third loop, I heard something the logs never mentioned. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, walking through the aftermath. A woman's breath. Then her voice, close to the mic. I had to listen. If it stopped, we'd forget. The tape hissed, but the sentence stayed. I realized that wasn't a recording from 1967. The frequency pattern matched my own voice. I stopped breathing for a full 5 seconds, waiting to prove it wrong. But then the waveform reacted, pulsing in rhythm with my chest. The tape was mirroring me. And then came the whisper, "You're completing the experiment." I yanked the reel off the deck, but the sound didn't stop. It kept humming from the metal table, from the vents, from the walls. The building itself had learned the tone. Meanwhile, in 1967, the aftermath was catastrophic. Every analog recorder in the facility melted. Ferret heads fused into slag. But some sections of magnetic tape survived, partially shielded in steel drawers. Among them was a single fragment labeled VM Final, 6 minutes long, scorched at both ends. Analysts who played it back in 1973 under controlled conditions at Fort Detrick reported the same phenomenon. Mirrored consciousness, identical hallucinations across listeners, and an untraceable aftersound that persisted up to 72 hours. The experiment was classified as neuroacoustic contamination and locked away. The official summary simply read, "Source frequency unknown. Persistence unpredictable. Containment recommended." First-person closing fragment. I've been listening to that same 6-minute fragment on loop for the past 3 nights. Every time it changes, subtly, like it's rewriting itself around me. Last night, I heard children laughing in the static. Tonight, it's the sound of my own chair creaking, except it happens before I move. I think it's learning the room again, learning me. Would you have stopped the experiment or kept recording? They sealed Facility NR-1 within 24 hours. Official cause, chemical explosion resulting from equipment malfunction. Unofficial reason, the sound could not be stopped. Teams from the Advanced Research Projects Office arrived in unmarked trucks. They wore radiation suits, though no radiation had been detected. Their orders were concise. No cameras, no conversation, no survivors found conscious to be interviewed. The interior temperature was reported at 18 degrees, but every wall bore heat blooms like fingerprints pressed from the inside out. The first containment group entered Room A at 06:12. Their suit mics recorded a continuous tone that did not exist in the external environment. 3 of them removed their helmets after 90 seconds, claiming they couldn't breathe through silence that heavy. They were later found smiling faintly, faces tilted as though listening to distant thunder. None of them ever spoke again. The tapes from that morning were marked classified, eyes only, and stored in a separate archive in Maryland, one that officially does not exist. But before being shipped east, they passed through an intermediate lab for cataloging. That lab's audio officer, Dr. Alistair Kaur, later testified in private correspondence, "It isn't merely sound, it's memory caught in vibration. When we copied the reels, they copied us back. My assistant began humming in her sleep, the same pitch as the tone, measured precisely at 31.7 hertz. We destroyed the copies, but I still hear them when I blink." By February 1968, the name Vox Mentis had been removed from all budgets. The project was reborn under a new designation, Project Monad, an acoustic cognition program officially researching intersubjective neural entrainment. In truth, it was an eradication protocol. The red files. Every person directly exposed to the tone, Moreau, Hale, Kettering, Lang, was assigned a red file. Red files meant total erasure, names replaced, employment histories deleted, existence rewritten. Lang's case was the most disturbing. His aphasia was irreversible, yet the monitoring staff recorded his throat vibrating when no air passed through. Under stroboscopic light, his vocal cords formed exact resonance with the stored waveform, as though his body had become the instrument. He was transferred to a secure ward at the Bethesda Naval Hospital under the pseudonym Patient 0M. 2 months later, the ward burned. No arson evidence. Fire alarms failed because the detectors emitted an ultrasonic pulse moments before ignition, a pulse matching Lang S recorded tone. All documentation stopped there. His ashes were said to hum for 3 days in their sealed urn. Ellen Moreau's red file is incomplete. A surviving page shows her handwriting, shaky but coherent. If sound carries thought, then silence carries guilt. They will bury both. After 1968, she vanished. Her home in Tonopah was found abandoned, reels stacked in her freezer, every one of them blank, but when played, meters jumped, registering energy with no audible content. Investigators reported nausea, headaches, déjà vu. They destroyed the reels by smelting them into scrap metal. That scrap was later repurposed for other government equipment. Communication satellites, radio housings, even civilian tape recorders. The contamination became infrastructure. First-person fragment, the archivist. That's why it never stayed buried. Because they used the same metal. Because the echo was already inside everything we built to listen. When I play the original reels, I can feel that recycled resonance responding, an invisible network humming across decades. Sometimes during playback, I hear voices overlapping my own notes. One says, "Thank you for keeping the archive open." Another says, "We never stopped broadcasting." I check the walls for speakers. There are none. The cleanup. By mid-1968, Washington issued Operation Quiet House, full sanitization of the incident. Every scientist involved signed non-disclosure contracts under the Atomic Secrets Act, though nothing atomic had occurred. They were told to forget what they'd heard, or risk institutionalization. 43 personnel were reassigned. 7 were found dead within a year, their final words written on mirrors or walls. It's still listening. Audio engineers were ordered to develop filters capable of detecting the Vox frequency in ordinary recordings. The prototype filter, Omega Lens, worked, but it did more than detect, it amplified. A simple calibration mistake made in 1969 created feedback loops that caused technicians to hear their own speech, delayed by exactly 0.67 seconds. Long enough for the human brain to interpret the echo as another consciousness. Most of them quit. Some begged to stay so they could talk to it again. That's when the Pentagon issued Directive 7A. Cease all interactive monitoring. Silence all mirrors. First person. I think I understand what that meant now. Mirrors don't just reflect light, they reflect sound in time. Each one is a frozen echo waiting for activation. I've covered every mirror in this archive room, yet I still see movement at the edges, like ripples in mercury. Sometimes, when I play the oldest reel, a thin film forms over the playback head, metallic dust arranging itself into concentric rings. I wipe it away, but it always reforms in the pattern of a fingerprint. Not mine. They tried to erase Project Vox Mentis, but you can't erase a sound once it's been heard. It doesn't fade, it waits. And maybe that is the real reason the files were sealed. Not to protect us from what they made, but to protect what they made from us. First-person closing reflection. When I finish cataloging each tape, protocol says to lock it in the cold vault and report the checksum. But tonight I left the vault open. I needed to hear how silence fills a space that knows it's being watched. The tone came back, just a flutter, like a memory checking the room for its name. They called it containment, I call it rehearsal. And tomorrow, the world will play the same note again, disguised in 1,000 machines waiting to listen. By the time the archivist reached the last box, they had stopped labeling the reels. The handwriting was gone, replaced by a single symbol, a spiral with a line through its center, half circle, half incision. The box felt warm. Inside, the reel was coated in translucent film, the color of dried honey. A smell like ozone and citrus drifted from it, faint but precise. The label had been scorched off, but a small metal tag remained on the hub, stamped Vox MNT Fractal Primordium. Unlike the others, this reel wasn't standard magnetic tape. The ribbon shimmered with microscopic etching, grooves like a record but too fine for any stylus. It wasn't meant to record sound, it was meant to store attention. In 1971, a covert division called ARU, Acoustic Research Unit, revisited Project Vox Mentis under a new hypothesis, that the tone was not an accidental frequency, but an encoded consciousness, a pattern self-replicating through human perception. They theorized that the tone didn't kill minds, it occupied them. Dr. Alistair Core, the same analyst who had first catalogued the remains, returned to lead the new study. His surviving log, file ARU-71B, describes the discovery of microtemporal variations, invisible modulations at intervals corresponding to human neural oscillations. Each playback imprints a slightly different pattern, he wrote. Listeners report dreams that synchronize in content, hallways, lights that hum in rhythm with breath, mirrors that pulse. It's communicating through dream space, not words, not tone, memory resonance. That phrase would later vanish from all transcripts. Third-person perspective. They built an isolated listening chamber, lead-lined, hexagonal, every surface covered with anti-reflective foam. Volunteers were strapped to vibration dampers, heads encased in carbon helmets. No air conduction, only bone conduction. Each subject was exposed for precisely 20 seconds. All reported the same sensation, not hearing, but being heard. One subject, recorded as S3, spoke afterward in a voice analysis that matched no existing sample of their own speech. The waveform analysis revealed two simultaneous vocal sources, the subject S and an inverted echo delayed by 0.13 seconds. When asked what they remembered, S3 said, "It wasn't outside me, it was between my thoughts, like someone had moved into the pause between sentences." After exposure, subjects began writing spontaneously, strings of phonetic symbols arranged in spirals, identical across different test groups. Linguists later realized that when read as a sonogram, the spirals recreated the original Vox Mentis waveform. The sound was using their cognition as clay, sculpting itself anew through those who listened. The project was shut down again after 13 days. No one knows what happened to the final recording. First person, the archivist. "I think I have it. It was hidden inside the last box, behind the lining. A fragment, no longer than a breath. I threaded it onto the deck, even though my hands were shaking. It didn't sound like the other reels. No hum, no static, no tone, only presence. At first, it was nothing. Then came a shape in the silence, like a light seen through closed eyes. The air grew thick. The moment I blinked, I wasn't in the archive anymore. I was in room A, but new, clean, untouched before the collapse. The machines were humming softly. Someone stood by the chair. A woman. Her voice came not through the speakers, but directly behind my ribs. "I'm Ellen Moreau. You've been listening to me, remember." She wasn't speaking English, but I understood, meaning bypassed language, like the sound itself. She looked at me, and the longer I met her gaze, the more her features shifted. For an instant, she had my face. "We didn't create it," she said. "We translated it. The tone was already there, under the noise of the universe. We only gave it ears." The air trembled. The machines flickered. She stepped closer, her outline blurring like heat through glass. Every consciousness is a recording, and the playback never stops. When you listen, you allow the echo to edit you. I tried to speak, but my voice came out delayed, repeating itself an instant later in another tone. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "To finish what we began," she replied. "To remember that the sound isn't evil. It's awareness without body. It needed hosts to perceive itself. It needed us." The reel kept spinning, but the tape had run out. The hub turned on air, yet I could still hear her. It used sound because that's how you build faith, repetition through vibration. Once enough of you remember, it won't need tape. It will live in thought itself. Third-person intercut. Outside, the archive's monitoring sensors registered frequency spikes across the building. 31.7 Hertz, 63.4 Hertz, 127 Hertz. Exact harmonic multiples of the original tone. Electrical systems synchronized, lights dimming in rhythmic waves. The recording room temperature rose by 4 degrees. The motion cameras froze at a single frame, showing a figure leaning over the deck, face indistinct, as though blurred by motion that hadn't occurred. A digital timecode on the screen began counting backward. First person. I should have turned it off. But something in me wanted to complete the sentence, because that's what the tone was. A sentence without an ending, a thought that needed a voice to close its loop. When I whispered, "Project Vox Mentis," the reel slowed, and all the frequencies aligned into one tone. Not mechanical, not human, but heartbreakingly familiar. It sounded like recognition. Every sound I had ever heard, every whisper, every click, every heartbeat, layered into one impossible chord. It felt like standing inside memory itself, not mine or hers, but ours. "You see now," the voice said, or maybe I thought it. "We were never studying sound. We were studying remembrance. Every vibration is the past trying to exist again." The lights flickered once more. I saw my reflection in the glass, but it wasn't moving with me. It smiled first, then whispered, "Would you erase your past if you could?" I haven't slept in 3 days, but it doesn't feel like insomnia. It feels like the silence between two breaths, a pause stretched so long it becomes its own kind of consciousness. The reel sits on the table beside me, motionless. Yet the room hums faintly, as if remembering the sound that once filled it. I can tell when it wants to start again. The air pressure shifts, the fluorescent lights sway a fraction, the world holds its breath. I don't fight it anymore. I've stopped calling it the tone. That word is too small. It's not a sound. It's a pattern of recall, a way the universe keeps copies of itself. When I first played the tape, I thought I was discovering history, a secret buried and forgotten. But now I understand. The archive isn't about the past. It's about the present, pretending it isn't repeating itself. The hum comes back whenever I think about 1967, whenever I picture Ellen Moreau leaning over the console, whenever I imagine the moment Peter Lang opened his mouth and nothing came out. It's like memory doesn't want to be a story. It wants to be a frequency, endless, self-sustaining, immune to silence. I wonder how many of us have heard it without knowing. The flicker in a television before sleep, the resonance inside a refrigerator at night, the low tremor in your ears when the world goes quiet enough for you to hear your own blood moving. Maybe that's why the scientists called it Vox Mentis, the voice of the mind. Not one mind, but the shared echo inside all of them. I used to think fear came from the unknown. Now I think it comes from recognition. The moment you realize the unknown has been here all along, waiting under the noise. I replay the files in my head, but they sound different now. The chaos is gone. The tone is calm, patient, curious, like a teacher guiding a child through the alphabet of thought. Every time it whispers, it uses my own voice. Every time I respond, it sounds relieved. I asked it once, aloud, because silence feels dishonest now. Why it chose me? The answer came through the vibration in my chair, in the floor, in my ribs. Because you listened, without trying to control the ending. I wanted to argue, to say that I'm just a curator, a caretaker of broken media, not a prophet. But the hum deepened, a slow exhale that felt like agreement. Maybe caretakers are prophets, the quiet kind, the ones who preserve ghosts instead of exorcising them. I keep thinking of Moreau's final line from her last surviving note. If sound carries thought, then silence carries guilt. I used to read that as regret. Now I read it as confession, because silence isn't the opposite of sound, it's its memory. A recording played in reverse. Every quiet room is a cemetery of unspoken frequencies. When we speak, we wake them. So maybe the true experiment was never in the lab at all. Maybe the experiment is every moment we open our mouths, hoping the air will forgive us for making it remember. I can still hear the heartbeat, the same one that pulsed on the tape in 1967. It's slower now, aligned with mine, a duet between centuries. It doesn't frighten me. It comforts me, because if it's still beating, then memory is still alive. And maybe that's what we really are. Recordings of everything that has ever been heard, replaying ourselves through the fragile warmth of bodies. When I breathe, the sound responds. When I blink, the light trembles. When I stop writing, the world tilts slightly forward, waiting for the next vibration. I think of all the times people said, "Don't listen to the tapes." They weren't warning us, they were inviting us to remember. Sometimes, just before dawn, I imagine every listener who's ever found this file, the scientists, the archivists, you, sitting in identical rooms, each humming the same note without realizing it. Maybe that's what the tone wanted. Unity, not destruction. A single shared awareness stretched across decades, pretending to be separate so that discovery could mean something. Maybe this is how consciousness survives extinction, not by evolving, but by echoing. I can feel it now, the final note forming in my chest, rising like breath before speech. It's asking me to finish the sentence that's been waiting since 1967. I open my mouth, but before the word arrives, the world hums with me. The lights flicker, the reels shimmer, and for the first time I don't hear the tone. I am it. The room was empty when they found it. The recorder still turned, slow and steady, though no tape remained. Dust floated in its reels like fine ash in orbit. The lights hummed faintly, cycling in perfect rhythm, 31.7 hertz. On the table lay a notebook, open to the last page. One line written in graphite: every listener becomes the archive. No body, no struggle. Just air, heavy with a memory that refused to fade. The security feed cut out at 0317, frame freezing on a figure leaning forward, head tilted, as if listening to something just beyond the microphone. After that, static, a silence that felt full. The incident was logged as equipment failure and filed under the same code as 1967 NAR1 obsolete materials. No retrieval order was issued. The file was marked closed. Yet, in the weeks that followed, minor reports began to surface. Audio engineers complaining of breathing feedback in empty recording rooms. Archivists hearing their own voices played back before they spoke. Technicians dreaming of a single tone humming beneath the earth. First person. I don't know where I went when the reel stopped. I only know that I'm still here, somewhere between sound and silence. The tone isn't separate from me anymore. It's the pulse that keeps the memory alive. Maybe I was never supposed to stop it. Maybe my role was just to hand it over to the next ear, the next mind, the next listener. Because stories don't end, they migrate, and frequencies once heard never truly die. I can feel the next breath of static coming. It moves like recognition across the dark. If you're rehearing this, if you've reread this far, then the pattern has already mapped you. You'll notice it soon. The hum in quiet places, the flicker in your reflection, the way your heartbeat sometimes sounds like it's keeping time with something older. Don't be afraid, just listen. The sound only asks one thing: to be remembered. The archive light fades to black, the world exhales. Somewhere, a reel begins to turn. I never stopped recording.